Good evening to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our latest update on Tropical Storm Debby, as it's expected to become a hurricane before landfall tomorrow morning on the Big Bend region of Florida, and the potential for an extreme, massive flood threat all across the southeast, which will linger well on into next week. We have a lot to go over in today's video. Let's get started with the latest information as of 5 p.m. by the National Hurricane Center on Tropical Storm Debby. Maximum sustained winds are 65 miles per hour and minimum central pressure of 992 millibars. So we've not seen that much intensity change since the last update that we did on video this morning. Little bit of a halt intensification today in Debby, but I'm going to show you in just a moment that that might be changing soon, and we're definitely on track for a hurricane landfall on the Big Bend region by tomorrow morning. If you're tracking it on a map, it's located at 27.7 north and 84.4 west. The movement is north at 12 miles per hour, and once again, we'll probably see a little bit more of a northeastward movement in the coming hours as it aims itself towards the Big Bend. We also have another area of interest, though, in the Atlantic, and this will be something to watch, especially once Debby moves inland, because this could actually be something to watch for the Caribbean and Gulf as we head into the end of this week, into early next week. End of this week, meaning the week starting tomorrow. So we'll have to keep an eye on this really closely. And then really quickly before we move on to the latest with Debby, just want to show you the Eastern Pacific is very active right now. We have two other new storms. There's Carlota, which was a hurricane previously, and it is now weakening. And then we have Tropical Storm Daniel, which is probably going to remain weak. And then there's Tropical Depression 5E, which will probably become another named storm. And I think the next named storm on the list in the Pacific is Amelia. This will also stay weak, and this will probably develop into another tropical storm, but stay weak as well. So lots going on in the Pacific, but once again, no immediate threat to land, which is a good thing. It's really all focused right now on Debby, which in the latest satellite presentation, you could see definitely starting to hold itself together a lot more. Intensification did halt a little bit today because of the dry air that I mentioned earlier on. Did try to make its way into the core a little bit, but it did undergo some sort of structural realignment with its core this morning. We saw it rapidly intensify for a little bit. And now it seems like it's probably about to start another bout of rapid intensification. Just look at all these convective bursts that have been firing near the center. And if you take a look at it on radar as well, you can actually start to see now on radar, because this is well in radar view, as it approaches the Big Bend. And this will definitely be a useful tool to keep track of organization without having to have recon in there all the time. Although there is recon headed towards Debby right now, so we'll see how it is developing in terms of its core. But you could see there is some sort of eye wall formation starting to get together with Debby too. Not too defined yet. It's probably going to take a few more hours, but especially with these convective bursts that I've been firing, I'd imagine that Debby will definitely try to organize more. And once again, it is definitely very likely to become a hurricane as it approaches the Gulf. And then you could see as well all of these bands surrounding it. This is going to be the other threat, or part of the other threat, which will be the heavy rainfall. And especially today into tomorrow, these outer bands producing tornadoes. And if we look at the Storm Prediction Center, there's actually a tornado watch in effect for much of the Florida Peninsula right now because of these outer bands, which will produce tornadoes. I think there have already been tornado warnings throughout today as a result with Debby. You can see slight risk for severe weather today, 5% chance for tornadoes, and then the wind. And obviously, there's not much of a hail threat because this is a tropical system. It's not like we're dealing with a line of severe storms. But the biggest threat does rely on the tornadoes. We're probably going to see a bunch of quick spin ups, and especially even if you're not going to experience the hurricane force winds by Debby when it makes landfall, which will probably only be a few people in the Big Bend. You'll definitely be dealing with the rainfall and probably with the tornado risk as well. That is something to keep in mind, and especially with these tropical systems as they head inland, they do produce tornadoes. And we've had pretty big tornado outbreaks, especially with our recent tropical storm landfalls. barrel, when it made landfall in Texas, it produced quite a few tornadoes itself. And this will probably be the same as the risk runs today and into tomorrow for tornadoes. Once again, high risk for tornadoes, 5%. Well, it's not super high, but relative to Storm Prediction Center chances, 5% is a pretty decent risk. But obviously, the tornadoes is the main threat, as not much is really expected with the wind and hail at all. So that is something to keep in mind in. What about the threat for the coastline? Obviously, the main thing will be this making landfall as a hurricane. National Hurricane Center expects this to make landfall as a mid to high end Category 1. The latest advisory brings this as a hurricane probably sometime late tomorrow morning. And I should mention, too, that this is going to start to slow down, it seems like, as this heads towards the coastline. So that'll mean maybe a few extra hours on land if this slows down enough before landfall. Although I did hear something about a little bit of shear right as it makes landfall, so maybe we'll see how that impacts things. But this will likely become a hurricane probably within the next few hours. Who knows, maybe Recon is already finding Debby to be a hurricane. We'll just have to see. But a hurricane is very likely. There's obviously warnings in effect for that. And I also did mention, once again, National Hurricane Center expects a Category 1. If Debby is able to really consolidate over the next several hours, I said this morning, I personally wouldn't be shocked if we do see this try to make a run for Category 2 status, if this is able to intensify very quickly over the next several hours. It is certainly possible given how quickly we were able to see it intensify for a short bit this morning. But either way, that will cause a risk for storm surge. That is also one of the other coastal risks as well, especially near the Suwannee River to the Okolokoni River. Hard to pronounce names, but I tried my best. This seems to be the max area of storm surge, 6 to 10 feet. But once again, as I mentioned, widespread impacts with Debby. Sure, we're seeing the highest surge in the Big Bend region, but we're still seeing decent surge into Tampa Bay of around 3 to 5 feet, and that is certainly enough for flooding. In fact, there's already been video of flooding coming out from the central and southwestern coasts of Florida because of storm surge from Debby. And obviously, they're not getting the direct impacts at all, but it's because of the influence of Debby is very large. Once again, with the rainfall too, and with the storm surge as well, right along the coast. So lots of threats to keep on top of, and especially when it comes to widespread impacts, that'll be a common theme, especially when it comes to the rainfall aspect of this. As this gets into northern Florida and the Carolinas, which even then they also have a storm surge risk of 2 to 4 feet right now along the Georgia and South Carolina coastline. Once again, onshore flow will be pushing the water into the coast. And it'll likely not be 6 to 10 feet because it'll likely not be as strong of a storm in the Big Bend region, but it'll certainly be enough that the storm surge will be an added risk along the coastline for flooding as well, on top of the probably very heavy rains that we will have. And also adding on to the whole rainfall situation, the northern Gulf, where Debby is going to be tracking in, where it's already in basically, and it'll be in over the next several hours up until landfall. Very, very warm sea surface temperatures. In fact, you can see the isobar where we're in is 31 degrees Celsius, meaning we're in solid 31 degrees Celsius waters. There's even a few 32 readings probably in here, and that's going to help rapid intensification of Debby up until landfall tomorrow morning. And once again, just saying, personally would not be surprised if this becomes or tries to make a run at Cat 2 status tomorrow. And really quickly though, before we move on to the models, just want to talk about the storm surge once again. Should have brought it up before I brought up the sea surface temperatures, but whatever. Storm surge warnings are in effect from the Tampa Bay to, it seems like, I think that is around no, that is not. That is near Indian Pass, sorry. So storm surge warnings in effect for portions just south of the Tampa Bay to near Indian Pass. Generally all of the Big Bend of Florida, is under a storm surge warning. Keep in mind as well, because of the shape of the Big Bend, it kind of acts as an alcove for water to just come in and funnel upward. Just has to do with geography, and that makes the Big Bend as well much more prone to storm surge as well. And even to an extent, a little bit the way the coast is shaped, or at least how it'll be shaped, in contrast to what the track of Debby will be once it gets to the Carolinas. There's also a storm surge warning for them as well. So keep in mind of the storm surge, that is another threat on top of the rainfall too. Many threats to keep on top of once again over the next several days with Debby. So let's go over the GFS model to see what they show. This is analyzed as of 12Z. Obviously, a lot more on the weaker side than what Debby actually was at 12Z this morning. But even then, take a look at the GFS over the next several hours, especially heading into tonight, into tomorrow. Rapid intensification up until landfall, 980 millibars on the GFS, so that is definitely a hurricane making landfall in the Big Bend of Florida, probably Category 1, and it wouldn't shock me even if we get a Category 2 as well. And then just notice, this is then the second part, so this making landfall as a hurricane is the first part, and then the second part of the threat will be, just notice how erratically and slowly Debby moves over the next several days. So we're at 48 hours. So day 2, day 3, day 4, still right over the northern Florida, Carolinas region, barely moves at all. And then day 5, it just hangs around along the southeast, and it's going to cause heavy rainfall to be dumped over areas repeatedly, and that is just going to help with the flash flooding risk to be through the roof. And really quickly though, in terms of intensity of Debby, the H-Wharf, if we look at a hurricane model, this is going to rapidly intensify before Florida. H-Wharf brings us down to 979 millibars and wind intensity of 70 knots before it makes landfall in Florida. And then even on the H-Wharf as well, just notice how Debby kind of stalls out and doesn't move much at all across the southeast. And that, once again, is just going to help play into the rainfall threat, which will be tremendous. Because look at the Weather Prediction Center forecasts for the next several days, for the next 5 days. So this is going to be well into next week. We're looking at areas, especially seems like Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, 2 pretty populous cities, actually, both in the shadings for where we'll potentially see 16 to 20 inches of rain, probably areas that will see locally 2 feet of rain, and that is a lot of rain. That is certainly going to help with flash flooding. And then notice around that, widespread areas of where we'll probably see up to a foot of rain, stretching all the way from the Big Bend of Florida into near the Outer Banks of the Carolinas. So that's a huge swath of people that are going to get a foot of rain, very high risk for flash flooding. This screams major flooding disaster across the southeast, very much so. And even though, and this is something to keep in mind, because this is obviously not going to be a very strong system, even though it will become a hurricane before it makes landfall in the Big Bend. Don't have to repeat that. We obviously all know that by now. But regardless, it's still going to produce lots of flooding rain. And as I mentioned before, the number one killer in a tropical cyclone is the flooding rain. So the fact we're going to see lots of it over the next several days, it kind of is the icing on the cake when you look at the Weather Prediction Center flash flood risk over the next 5 days. You should be concerned because there's now a high risk for flash flooding across a decent portion of northern Florida and right along the southeastern and southern portions of Georgia and South Carolina, along the coast too, especially dependent on where Debby tracks. Looks like especially the coastal regions as well are going to take the brunt of the rain. So we have a lot to keep in mind of when it comes to Debby over the next several days. Watching, obviously, that this will probably make a landfall in Florida tomorrow morning as a hurricane. Very likely, I think, at this point. In fact, I think it's almost expected now. And then we got to watch over the next several days as the flooding, sort of mass flooding threat unfolds over the southeast. And it's not going to be pretty, that is for sure. And then after that, seeming like, according to the global models, we might have to watch the Caribbean and Gulf once again within the next week or so, especially with the European ensembles. And this is something we're going to cover a little bit more on the channel over the next several days instead of right now, once again, as Debby's kind of doing its thing over the southeast. Once Debby is fully said and done, we might have to be watching our eyes in the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean once again. As I showed you briefly, there is another area of interest on the National Hurricane Center, and that might be something, once again, that we need to watch. Certainly all this activity expected. It was expected to be a very active hurricane season, and as I'm going to say, it'll probably only be an uphill battle from here on out to the peak. With that being said, keep an eye on the tropics, especially if you're all throughout the southeast. If you found this video informative, I would really appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe, share with family and friends, especially if you have any family, friends, or loved ones in the southeast and you want this information to get to them. Please share this video. With that being said, stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we will definitely be talking again very, very soon.